All right, so yesterday I made a video that was discussing Joe Biden's administration coming out tepidly, in theory, supporting the general idea of relinquishing the COVID vaccine patents so that a lot of these developing or poorer countries can start the process of ramping up production and distribution of generic versions of the vaccines. And we talked about how they used very worrying language in the press release and how they didn't actually end up endorsing specifically the proposal that was put forward by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization. It's called the TRIPS waiver, and they didn't come out and say that they support the TRIPS waiver, and they said we're going to need to begin the process of negotiations surrounding how we're going to go about this process of relinquishing the COVID vaccine patents. And so because of that, and because we know who Joe Biden is and his connections to the pharmaceutical industry, it was pretty troubling because we don't really know what that means or how it's going to unfold, and basically the fight is not over. And so I got a great article here that was written by the Daily Poster. It's David Sirota and Andrew Perez outlet, so go and check them out in the description and support their work. They do awesome stuff, and they bring up the fight and how it's going to be oriented and played out, the people who are associated with Joe Biden and his inner circle, the influence that they're going to have, and the lines, the propaganda that these big pharmaceutical companies and the big pharmaceutical industry is going to put forward in the coming weeks or days or however it longs to do these negotiations. So here's what they have to say, just a quick outline real quick. So however, Ty's statement was narrow, talking about the trade representative who put out the statement about the vaccine patents. So it only mentioned COVID vaccines and avoided endorsing an existing broad waiver proposed by India and South Africa, which would cover diagnostic kits, vaccines, medicines, personal protective equipment, and ventilators. Her statement also preemptively warned, again, like we just said, that negotiations will take time given the consensus-based nature of the institution and the complexity of the issues involved, a process that could provide drug makers an opening to try to limit a final waiver. So this is exactly what we were just warning about yesterday when I said, because they're not specifically endorsing the TRIPS waiver, and because they say the negotiations are going to take time, that leaves open the door for these big pharmaceutical industries and the people in Biden's inner circle to start applying pressure in different ways to try to undercut the substance that would be behind a proposal like the TRIPS waiver. So here's what they start out with, the people in his inner circle that have corrupted influences. So let's just read a couple of these. Antony Blinken, this is an interesting one. I didn't know this connection existed, but Antony Blinken, before he was appointed as Secretary of State, Blinken helped form a corporate consulting firm called West Exec Advisors. His client list included pharmaceutical giant Gilead Sciences, which manufactures remdesivir, the only drug approved in the U.S. By the FDA to treat COVID. Several U.S. government agencies conducted or funded much of the preclinical and clinical development of remdesivir, according to a report from Knowledge Ecology International. And between January and March, Gilead reported lobbying Congress and Blinken's State Department on, quote, international trade and protection of intellectual property, compulsory licensing, and other IP issues in multiple countries. And Gilead recently made headlines announcing it would give India 450,000 vials of remdesivir and help ramp up the production of its antiviral drug in the pandemic-ravaged country. On Tuesday, Gilead sued the Russian government after it allowed a domestic company to manufacture remdesivir. So they are acting aggressively on protecting these patents. And you see the connection there with Antony Blinken. Another one, Linda Thomas Greenfield, Biden's ambassador to the United Nations, previously worked for the consulting firm Albright Stonebridge Group, which has represented Pfizer. Another one, Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, Biden's deputy chief of staff, was a founding partner of the consulting firm Precision Strategies, which has worked for both Gilead and Pfizer. O'Malley Dillon's former colleague at the firm, Stephanie Cutter, is an advisor to a new nonprofit, Building Back Together, created to support Biden's agenda. The organization lists its business address as Precision Strategies Office in D.C. corporate records. Another one, Anita Dunn. Dunn's job as a senior advisor in the Biden White House is only a temporary, which means she doesn't have to file a public finance disclosure, but her firm, SKDK, has also worked with Pfizer. So you see the connections within his administration, the pressures and where they're going to be coming from as to who's representing the pharmaceutical industry in his administration. It's chock full of them. I mean, his entire administration is packed with big pharma, bought and corrupted members. I mean, this is just, it's absurd that this isn't illegal, honestly, and this type of thing should be illegal. All of the lobbying efforts and the connections with these different companies and past work that they've done, this is all just open and brazen corruption, but it's legal under our current system here in the United States of open and legal bribery. And so that's the people that are sort of surrounding, or some of the people that are surrounding him, that are going to be corrupting influences that we got to watch out for. On top of that, we're going to have to look at what the arguments are that these companies are actually using. So this is how we know what the fight is going to be in the coming weeks, that we're going to have to be discussing this. So in the lead up to the Biden administration's waiver announcement this week, drug makers manufacturing vaccines and other COVID-related products had already been gearing up for a battle. In the first quarter of 2021 alone, the pharmaceutical industry spent $92 million on federal lobbying efforts, much of it focused on fortifying intellectual property rules. $92 million in the first quarter of 2021. So what does that tell you? It tells you that these companies knew that this was coming. They knew that this fight was coming. And honestly, they probably know that they're on the wrong side of this, and that the general American public is not going to stand behind protecting their patents over saving millions of lives and lessening the chance of variants spreading around the world and keeping us safer. So they were preparing for this, and preparing with corrupting influences, upwards of $92 million. They continue. They were recently boosted by a letter from Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina to the Biden administration, arguing that the waiver requested by India and South Africa would would allow for the creation of entire industries in these countries that will compete with American companies in the development of cutting-edge healthcare technologies. How is that a bad thing? I mean, these are the same people, Tom Tillis, a Republican, who would go out and argue for the free market, right? Isn't the whole point of arguing for the free market that you have healthy competition that drives innovation? I mean, these people don't even know how to make the arguments for their own ideology. So what do you mean? I mean, the creation of entire industries in these countries that will compete with American companies in the development of cutting-edge healthcare technologies? How is that a bad thing? This just seems like one of those examples where Republicans say something is bad, or they say a good thing, and just expect people to latch onto that as if it's bad. I don't see this as a bad thing. They continue. Biotechnology Innovation Organization, a lobbying group that represents COVID vaccine makers Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, wrote a letter threatening that the Biden administration's waiver, quote, decision will act as an disincentive to companies to respond to the next pandemic. So they're threatening Biden and saying, whoa, if you release these the IPs for this, then when the next pandemic comes up, we're not going to have an incentive to create a vaccine for you. Dude, they're just openly admitting that unless you allow big pharmaceutical executives to price gouge the entire world, that there's no incentive to create life-saving drugs and save potentially millions of lives. I mean, has there ever been a better argument for nationalizing big pharma? Because the way I see it, scientists are the ones who do the innovating, okay? Big pharmaceutical companies, these corporations, the board of directors, the executives, the CEOs, they don't do innovation, okay? They buy innovations. So scientists do the innovations, and in many cases, it's scientists at the National Institutes of Health, a government-funded institution, and they do the innovating, and then the private corporations come in after the fact, buy up the patents, and then try to price gouge the entire world. This is what happens on repeat. So I'm not bought into the argument at all whatsoever that releasing these patents, and also, by the way, these companies have already profited billions of dollars from these vaccines already. So they just want more and more. But I'm not buying into the argument that this is going to reduce the chances of us, or the motivation for us, if in the next pandemic comes around, for us to produce a vaccine. The motivation is preventing catastrophic consequences. That's the motivation. The motivation is that we don't want our hospitals to be overrun. The motivation is that we don't want hundreds of thousands of people to die needlessly. That's the motivation. And if you don't care about the humanity side of it, well, then think about it from the economic side of it. As a country, do we really want a pandemic to just rampantly spread around society, affecting different economic sectors in a bunch of different ways, as we've seen over the last year? Is that the world that we want to create? Is that not motivation enough to prevent those consequences and develop a vaccine? I mean, these people are ridiculous and evil. I mean, that's evil to say, oh, well, this, if you give access to the rest of the world to develop vaccines and save lives, then we won't be able to profit absurdly, and therefore we won't want to make a vaccine next time this pandemic comes around, or any pandemic or disease comes around. It's evil shit. And this is exactly why we need to nationalize Big Pharma, because guess what? They're not doing innovating. The scientists are doing innovating. And you know who else can fund scientists? The government, as we do all the time. Okay? A lot of the underlying technology that went into producing these vaccines, the underlying mRNA technology, was produced through government funds. Okay? So the idea that we need to rely on these giant pharmaceutical companies to innovate us out of a pandemic is complete bullshit. So, you know what? Before the next pandemic rolls around and these motherfuckers try to refuse to make a vaccine because there's not enough profits in it for them, well, before the next pandemic comes around, how about we nationalize Big Pharma, and then we use the incentives of saving human lives and preventing disastrous economic consequences, and that can be our incentive to produce vaccines or treatments or whatever is necessary. So, listen, the fight is ongoing. Even though Biden announced that he, tepidly supports the vaccine waivers or waiving the vaccine patents, the fight is still continuing. These are the types of bullshit lines that they're going to try to bring up in this fight. And we have to push back. We have to push back with full force. And honestly, we still need to be pushing Joe Biden to straight up support the TRIPS waiver. There's no reason why he shouldn't just sign on to that existing waiver. There's no need for negotiations. Again, all it's going to do, as I point out in this article, is open the door for the corrupting influences that are surrounding Joe Biden and his administration. It's going to open the door for them to undercut this process all the way through.